close your eyes for a moment. Not too tight, just enough to let the world outside soften. Imagine you are lying in a very quiet room, perhaps with a window cracked open to let in the cool night air. The sounds are far away, muffled, like the hum of the city from a distance, or the occasional rustle of a leaf. This is the kind of quiet that invites stories, old stories, stories that have been waiting for a long time to be told in a gentle voice. Tonight, we are going to travel very far from wherever you are. We are going to climb slowly and carefully up into the thin mountain air of the Andes. Not the foothills, not the green valleys, but up to the high, stark places where the clouds are below you, and the sun feels like it could burn your skin in an instant, even when the wind is cold. This is not a journey of exertion for you tonight. No heavy packs, no gasping for breath. You can just lie there, safe and warm, while I describe the scene. We are going to meet some very skilled workers, the stonecutters of the Inca Empire. They were masters of stone in a way that we still cannot fully explain. They worked at altitudes that would leave most of us dizzy after just a few steps. Picture a mountain slope that is not green, but brown and gray and gold, covered in tough grass that bends to the wind. The air here is thin. It feels like it is made of less. You breathe, and you feel like you never quite get a full lungful. The wind is constant, a low hum that never stops. It whispers around the rocks and carries the sound of a murmuring stream far below. This is the Altiplano, the high plateau, and it is a place that makes you feel both very small and very awake. There's a clarity to the light. The shadows are sharp and deep. Now, imagine a team of workers, perhaps 100 or more, slowly moving a single block of stone. The stone is not small. It is massive, maybe as big as a small car or larger. It is made of a hard, fine-grained rock, sometimes andesite, sometimes granite. They have no wheels. They have no iron tools that could cut through rock like butter. They have only stone hammers, wooden levers, ropes made of twisted llama or alpaca wool, and the strength of their own bodies. And they have patience, the patience of centuries. Their task is to shape this stone so perfectly that it fits against its neighbor without any mortar, without any gap you could slide a piece of paper into. They have to carve the complex shapes needed for the walls of Sacsayhuaman, those zigzagging walls of massive polygonal blocks, or the smooth, precise curves of Coricancha, the temple of the sun. Some of these stones have up to 12 faces, angles that interlock like a giant puzzle, a puzzle meant to withstand earthquakes. And they do. To this day, those walls stand, even in the most violent shakes of the earth. But how did they do it? How did they work in that thin air, where every simple task feels like it requires 10 times the effort? The answer is not in a single secret, but in a long, slow, and deeply intelligent process. Let us step closer to the quarry. It is high, very high, sometimes at elevations above 13,000 feet. The workers live in small villages made of stone and thatch, clustered on the slopes. Their lungs have adapted over generations. Their blood holds more oxygen. They have a capacity for endurance that we, who live at sea level, can barely comprehend. The stone is cut from the living rock. They do not blast it. They hammer long grooves into the stone using harder river rocks. They heat the rock with fire and then splash it with cold water to make it crack along these lines. This is a delicate balance. Too much heat and the stone breaks wrong. Too much water and it shatters into useless pieces. They know exactly when to pour the water at that precise moment when the crack will run true. It is a kind of ancient chemistry, a bit of geology, and a whole lot of patience. Once the block is separated, the real work begins. They have to drag it down the mountain, or rather up and over and around. The path is not flat. It is a steep, rocky track. They sing as they work, a low, rhythmic chant that helps them pull in time. Their feet are wrapped in sandals made from the hide of the llama. The ground is rough and cold. They use logs as rollers, but logs are scarce this high up. So sometimes they just pull the stone over the bare rock, using a simple drag sled. The stone grinds against the granite mountain, leaving a polished path behind them that you can still see today if you look closely. And all the while, they are breathing. They breathe deeply, slowly, with every pull. The air is so thin that your head can pound, your vision can spot. But they are conditioned. They have been doing this since they were children. They know to pace themselves. They know when to stop and rest in the shadow of the stone, sipping chicha, a corn beer that is both nourishment and ceremony. They do not rush. There is no deadline. The only deadline is the will of the Inca, and the Inca, the emperor, is not a man of hasty decisions. He expects perfection. Let us talk about the stonecutters themselves. They were professionals. They were specialists, a group of craftsmen who passed down their knowledge from father to son, from mother to daughter. Yes, there were women in the quarries too, carrying water, preparing food, and sometimes even shaping smaller stones. The work was community work. It was a mitta, a form of labor service owed to the state, like a tax paid in work days. But it was not seen as drudgery. It was a sacred duty. These stones were for the gods, for the sun, for the earth mother, for the ancestors. Imagine the sound of the work. The tap, tap, tap of a harder stone against a softer one. A stone hammer called a champi, shaped from a tough river cobble. Strike and strike, thousands of times, to remove just a tiny flake of rock. The flake is no bigger than your fingernail, but after an hour, they have removed a handful. After a day, a small depression begins to form. After weeks, the rough block starts to take on its final shape. They are sculptors, but their brush is a rock, and their paint is the dust of the mountain. What is remarkable is the accuracy. The stones fit so perfectly that when the Spanish arrived centuries later, they could not believe it. They thought the Inca must have had a secret formula, a lost technology, something magical. But the truth is more humbling. The Inca stonecutters did not use mortar, not because they couldn't make it, but because they did not need it. They simply cut each stone to fit the stone beside it, using a process of trial and error. They would carve a stone, lift it into place, see where it didn't fit, lower it, knock off a tiny bit more, lift it again, check again, lower it again. Over and over, for days, for weeks, for a single stone. and they had no measuring tape as we know it. They used a simple cord with knots, a quipu, to keep track of dimensions. Or they just used their eyes. They had the eye of a master carver, an eye that could see a curve or an angle that is off by a hair's breadth. And when the stone was finally perfect, it stayed perfect. The walls have stood for 500 years through countless tremors and earthquakes, and they have not shifted. The stones are so tightly fitted that they move as a single unit in an earthquake. The Inca designed their walls to be flexible. They built them slightly tilted inward, so that if the ground shakes, the walls press together, tighter, stronger. Let us think about the thin air again. At 13,000 feet, your breath comes short. Your heart beats faster. The sun is fierce. The ultraviolet rays are stronger. You can get sunburned in minutes, even on a cloudy day. The wind chills you. You have to drink water constantly, or you get dehydrated without knowing it. The Inca workers had thick, coarse wool tunics. They wore hats, sometimes woven with patterns that told their stories, their lineage. They were exposed. They had no modern boots, no safety harnesses, no hard hats. They worked on scaffolds made of sticks and rope. They climbed the stones like they were born to it. There's a story, a small, lightly humorous detail that the Spanish wrote about. They saw the Inca workers moving stones so large that it took hundreds of men to pull them. And the Inca shouted and sang, and the stones seemed to move on their own, like they were alive. The Spanish, with their guns and their horses, were awed. They saw a civilization that could move mountains, literally, but without the noise of iron and gunpowder. The only sound was the creak of rope, the shuffle of sandaled feet, the low chant. And that chant, that rhythm, might have been the key to their endurance. When you work at altitude, you must pace your breath. If you try to rush, you collapse. So they learned to work in a steady, metronomic rhythm. They moved with the wind, not against it. They worked in the morning when the air was still, and they rested during the hottest part of the day. They timed their work to the sun and the seasons. They knew that in winter, the cold would make the stone brittle, easier to crack. In summer, the rain would make the ground muddy, easier to slide the stones. And they honored the stone. Before they cut it, they made offerings. They poured chicha on the ground. They buried coca leaves, a sacred plant that helps with altitude sickness, that gives a little energy when you chew it. They talked to the mountain, to the Apu, the spirit of the peak. They asked permission. They thanked the mountain for giving its stone, its body, for the building of a temple or a fortress. So tonight, as you lie in the quiet, think of those stones. Think of the millions of taps, the years of patience, the lungs that learned to work on less. The Inca stonecutters were not just builders. They were keepers of a memory of how to work with the earth rather than against it. They did not fight the thin air. They moved with it. They became part of the mountain. And we will only begin to climb a little further next time. For now, let the image of that slow, careful work settle in your mind. The sound of stone against stone, the whisper of wind, the distant cry of a condor, the long, deep breath of a people who built for eternity. So let us stay here a moment longer, in that quiet place between the taps. The stone dust settles slowly, like a fine snow that never melts. It coats the workers' tunics, their hands, their faces, until they become the color of the mountain itself. They are not separate from the rock. They are part of it, breathing in its ancient minerals, leaving a little of themselves behind with every flake. Now, you might wonder about the tools themselves. The champi, the hammerstone, was often a river cobble made of diorite or quartzite, harder than the andesite or granite they were shaping. They would select these cobbles from riverbeds far below, carrying them up the mountain in woven bags. The cobbles were not perfect. They were roughly round, about the size of a fist. But the Inca knew that a stone with a slight flat face could be used for more precise striking, while a rounded one was better for rough shaping. They would sometimes tie a short leather strap around the hammerstone, a kind of handle, so that they could swing it with more control. But most of the time, they simply gripped the stone in their bare hands and struck with practiced accuracy. Each blow was a decision. The angle of the strike, the force, the spot on the stone, all had to be exact. If you strike too close to the edge, you risk breaking off a large chunk that might ruin the shape. If you strike too far from the edge, nothing happens. So they developed a feel for the rock, a kind of conversation. They would tap the stone first, listening to the sound. A sharp, ringing tone meant the stone was solid. A dull thud meant there was a hidden crack. They would trace the grain of the stone with their fingers, feeling the subtle lines that ran through it, like the veins in a leaf. And then they would begin, slowly, patiently, chipping away at the surface. You might think that the goal was to make the stone perfectly smooth, like a polished floor. But that was not the Inca way. The finished stones were often left with a slight texture, a matte finish that caught the light softly. They did not carve intricate patterns on every block. The beauty was in the fit, the precision of the joints. The surface was secondary. The real art lay in the angles, the curves, the way the stones locked together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. And here is a detail that the Spanish, with their iron tools and their rush, could not understand. The Inca did not carve a stone to a precise measurement and then try to fit it in. Instead, they carved the stone to match its neighbors as they went. They would set a stone in place, often with the help of a temporary platform or a ramp of earth. Then they would lower the stone gently, using ropes made from maguey fiber, which is strong and flexible. They would check the gap between the new stone and the one beside it. If the gap was too wide, they would mark the spot with a bit of charcoal or a scratch from a harder stone. Then they would lift the stone again, carve away the marked area, and lower it again. This process would repeat, often dozens of times, until the gap was so narrow that you could not slide a piece of paper through it. Think about the patience required for this. A single stone could take weeks to fit, and there were hundreds of stones in a single wall. The workers did not seem to mind. They saw it as a kind of meditation, a way of honoring the stone and the gods. They would often sing as they worked, a low, repetitive melody that helped them keep time and also distracted them from the cold and the thin air. The songs were not about the work itself. They were about the sun, the earth, the ancestors. They were old songs, passed down through generations, and they carried a sense of continuity that made the long hours feel meaningful. Now, let us consider the role of the quipu, the knotted cords that the Inca used for record keeping. You might think of it as a kind of accounting system, and that is partly true. But the quipu was also used to record dimensions and measurements. The knots and their positions on the cords could represent numbers, but they could also represent shapes. A particular knot might mean a right angle or a curve of a certain radius. The workers did not have blueprints on paper. They had a quipu keeper, a specialist who could read the knots and tell the stonecutters what the next stone should look like. This was a form of oral and tactile tradition, passed down from master to apprentice. And the masters were highly respected. They were part of a guild, a kind of brotherhood of stoneworkers who lived together in a special neighborhood near the quarry. They were exempt from other forms of labor tax because their work was considered essential to the state. They were fed and clothed by the Inca, given good food like dried meat, maize, and potatoes, all sourced from the terraced fields that climbed the mountainsides. They were also given coca leaves, which they chewed to combat altitude sickness and fatigue. The coca leaf is a mild stimulant, and it also helps with thirst and hunger. The Spanish, when they arrived, tried to ban coca because they associated it with pagan rituals, but the workers continued to use it in secret. It was too useful to give up. The daily rhythm of the stonecutters was dictated by the sun. They would wake before dawn, while the stars were still bright in the thin, clear sky. Their breath would plume in the cold. They would eat a simple breakfast of toasted maize and dried fish if they had it. Then they would walk to the quarry, their feet crunching on the frost-covered gravel. The first hour of work was always the hardest. The air was coldest, the muscles stiff. They would start with simple tasks, carrying water or clearing debris to warm up. Then, as the sun climbed over the eastern peaks and the warmth seeped into their bones, they would begin the serious shaping. The sun at altitude is not like the sun at sea level. It is fierce, and it burns quickly. They learned to cover their skin with a paste made from clay and water, a primitive sunscreen that also helped keep the stone dust from clogging their pores. They would rotate positions frequently, moving from the direct sun into the shade of a large stone or a makeshift awning of wool. They drank constantly, water mixed with a little ground maize, a sort of thin porridge that provided energy and electrolytes. They knew that dehydration could come on suddenly at altitude, causing headaches, dizziness, and confusion. They watched each other for signs of trouble, and if a worker started to stumble or become confused, they would sit him in the shade and give him coca leaves until he recovered. And there is something else about working at altitude that we must consider. The body changes over time. The workers who had grown up in the highlands had larger lung capacities and more red blood cells, which allowed them to carry oxygen more efficiently. They were adapted, but even they had limits. A newcomer from the lowlands would struggle to keep up and often had to take frequent breaks. The Inca were aware of this, and they would send workers to the quarry in shifts, rotating them every few weeks to avoid the worst effects of altitude sickness. They also provided a special diet for the stonecutters, rich in iron and protein, to help their bodies produce more red blood cells. But perhaps the most important adaptation was mental. The thin air changes your perception of time. It slows you down. You cannot rush. You learn to move with deliberation, to pause and breathe before lifting a heavy stone. You learn to accept that a task will take as long as it takes. And in that acceptance, there is a kind of peace. The Inca stonecutters understood this deeply. They did not see their work as a race. They saw it as a ritual. Each stone was an offering. Each wall was a prayer. And so the walls rose, slowly, silently, over decades and centuries. The stones were dragged up steep slopes, lifted into place, adjusted, lowered, adjusted again. The sound of tapping echoed across the valleys, a constant, gentle percussion that became part of the landscape. The condors circled overhead, curious, perhaps, at the slow movement of these small figures on the mountainside. The wind carried the sound of chanting, weaving it into the fabric of the air. Now, let us think about one particular stone, the famous 12-angled stone in Cusco. You have probably seen pictures of it. It is a single block of green diorite set into a wall at the corner of a street. It has 12 perfectly cut sides, and it fits seamlessly into the stones around it. For centuries, people have wondered how a civilization without iron tools could create such a precise shape. The answer, as with most Inca construction, lies not in the tool, but in the method. That stone was shaped by hundreds of hours of patient tapping, by dozens of trial and error lifts. It was not planned in advance, it evolved. The stonecutter simply kept carving until the stone fit, and then he stopped. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that when the Spanish took over Cusco, they tried to remove that stone to use for a building of their own. They brought horses and ropes, but they could not budge it. They tried to break it with sledgehammers, but the diorite refused to crack. Finally, they gave up and left it where it was, and it remains there today, a testament to the skill and patience of the Inca stonecutters. But let us not get too caught up in the famous stones. There are thousands of less famous stones, hidden in ruins high in the mountains, that have never been seen by tourists. Some are in places so remote that they are only accessible on foot after days of climbing. The Inca built terraces on sheer cliffs, canal systems that still water crops, and storehouses that kept grain dry for years. All of this was done with the same careful hand, the same slow rhythm, the same respect for the material. And perhaps the most important lesson from these stonecutters is that you do not need to be fast to be effective. In our modern world, we are always in a hurry. We want to finish things quickly, to check off boxes, to move on to the next task. But the Inca knew that some things cannot be rushed. A wall that is built in haste will fall in an earthquake. A stone that is cut quickly will break. So they took their time, and they built for eternity. Listen to the quiet now. The taps have stopped. The workers have gone home for the evening, their silhouettes moving slowly down the trail. their shadows long in the amber light. The stones remain cool and silent, absorbing the warmth of the day. And in the thin air, the stars begin to appear one by one, as they have for thousands of years. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine that you are there, lying on a bed of stone dust, looking up at the Milky Way, knowing that you have contributed something that will last beyond your own lifetime. It is a peaceful thought and a gentle one, and it carries us naturally into the next part of our story, where we will consider the spiritual dimension of the work, the relationship between the stonecutters and the mountains they lived on. But for now, let us rest here in the quiet of the high Andes, with the sound of the wind and the memory of slow, careful hands shaping the stone that holds the sky. And so we drift into the spiritual dimension of the work. The Inca stonecutters were not merely builders, they were priests of a kind, or at least participants in a sacred conversation between the human world and the world of the gods. The mountains themselves were alive. They were apis, powerful spirits that watched over the valleys, controlled the weather, and demanded respect. Before a stone was ever moved, the workers would make an offering. They would pour a little chicha, corn beer, onto the ground, and they would burn a small amount of coca leaves, watching the smoke rise into the thin air. They would ask the mountain for permission to take from its body, because the stone was not just material, it was the flesh of the earth. This was not a casual request. It was a serious negotiation, conducted with the same care as a treaty between two nations. The curaca, the local leader, would oversee the ceremony. He would wear a special tunic, woven from alpaca wool, dyed with cochineal for the red that symbolized the earth, and sometimes with indigo for the sky. He would hold a staff of polished stone, and he would speak the words of petition in Quechua, the language that flowed like water over rounded pebbles. The workers would stand in a circle, their heads bowed, their hands folded. They would wait for a sign, a sudden gust of wind, a shadow passing over the sun, the cry of a condor. If the sign was favorable, they would proceed. If not, they would wait, sometimes for a whole day, until the mountain gave its blessing. And then the work would begin. But now it was infused with a different quality. The tapping of the hammers became a rhythm for prayer. The chipping of the stone was a form of song. Each blow was an offering, each spray of dust a release of spirit. The workers would sometimes sing in unison, a low, melodic chant that helped them synchronize their movements. The chant was not elaborate. It was a simple repetition of syllables, like the sound of wind through a canyon, but it united them into a single body. They became one organism, breathing together, lifting together, resting together. There is a lovely detail from the Spanish chronicler Guaman Poma de Ayala, who wrote about the Inca in the early 17th century. He describes how the stonecutters would pause at midday to make another offering. They would build a small fire and throw in bits of llama fat, which produced a sweet, smoky smell. They would sprinkle a few drops of chicha into the flames, and they would ask the sun, Inti, to give them strength. Then they would eat their lunch in silence, sitting on the stones they had shaped that morning, feeling the warmth of the stone through their tunics. They would look out over the valley, their eyes following the terraces that stepped down the mountainside like a staircase for giants. And they would feel a deep, quiet pride because they were part of something larger than themselves. This sense of connection to the divine also influenced how they handled mistakes. If a stone broke during shaping, they did not throw it away in frustration. They would set it aside and later use it in a less visible part of the wall, or they would break it further and use the pieces as filler. Waste was disrespectful to the mountain that had given the stone, and sometimes, when a stone cracked in a particular way, they would see it as a message from the Apu. They would stop work and hold a consultation with the shaman or Paco, who would interpret the crack as an omen. The Paco would burn more coca leaves and study the pattern of the smoke. If the omen was bad, they might abandon the quarry entirely and move to a different site. This happened, according to local oral traditions, at a quarry near Tambo. There is a cluster of enormous stones, some weighing over 100 tons, that were left unfinished. They are still there, sitting on the mountainside like abandoned toys of the gods. The story is that the stonecutters were working on a particularly massive block when a series of cracks appeared overnight. The Paco was called, and he said that the mountain was angry. The workers offered more chicha, more coca, more llama fat, but the cracks continued. Finally, they decided to leave the stone where it was and move to a different part of the mountain. That stone is still there, half-carved, a reminder that even the most skilled artisans must sometimes yield to forces beyond their control. But most of the time, the offerings were accepted, and the work proceeded with a steady, unhurried pace. The spiritual dimension of the work also extended to the tools. The stonecutters did not see their hammers and chisels as mere objects. They were sacred instruments, blessed by the Paco before use. A new hammer would be smeared with a paste of coca and fat, and the Paco would murmur a blessing over it, asking the spirit of the stone to be gentle with the tool. The hammer was then treated with great care. It was not left on the ground overnight because the cold might steal its spirit. It was stored in a special pouch made from alpaca wool, hung in a dry place away from the moisture that could seep in from the damp earth. And the stone itself was also alive. The Inca believed that stones had a kind of soul, or at least a memory. When a stone was shaped into a block and placed into a wall, it was not just fitting into a physical space, it was finding its rightful place in the cosmic order. This is why the joints are so precise. It was not enough for the stone to fit mechanically. It had to fit spiritually. The stonecutter would spend hours, sometimes days, making tiny adjustments, not because the stone was a few millimeters off, but because he felt that the stone was not yet comfortable. He could sense its resistance, its reluctance to settle. And he would work until the stone gave a subtle sigh and locked into place. Then he would know it was done. This is hard for us to understand, living in a world where a stone is just a thing, a resource to be exploited. But the Inca lived in a world where everything had a voice. The rivers spoke, The clouds spoke, the animals spoke, and the stones spoke too, if you knew how to listen. The best stonecutters were those who could hear the stones. They were called Rumi Yachachik, which roughly means the ones who teach stones. They did not dominate the stone, they coaxed it. They did not force it, they invited it. There's a story I want to share with you. A quiet little story that comes from the oral traditions of the Cuero people, who still live in the highlands and maintain many ancient customs. It is about a young stonecutter who was impatient. He wanted to prove himself, to make a stone fit faster than his master. He worked through the night, in the cold, with only a small candle made of llama fat to light his work. He chipped and chipped, but the stone would not fit. It was always slightly too big or slightly too small. He grew frustrated and began to strike harder, with more force. He broke 2 chisels and bruised his hand. Just before dawn, he gave up and sat down, exhausted. Then, in the dim light, he saw that the stone had shifted. A tiny crack had appeared, and from the crack, a small trickle of water began to flow. The stone was weeping, the old people said. It was crying because the young man had not asked its permission. The master found him there at sunrise, sitting beside the weeping stone. The master did not scold him. He simply placed a coca leaf on the stone and said a quiet prayer. Then he showed the young man how to speak to the stone, not with force, but with patience. The young man later became a great stonecutter himself. This story captures the essence of the Inca approach to work in the thin mountain air. It was not about strength, it was about listening. It was not about speed, it was about respect. And that respect extended not only to the stones, but to each other. The workers supported one another. If a man was struggling with a heavy block, others would come to help without being asked. They worked in Aini, which is a Quechua word for reciprocal labor. You do not count the minutes. You offer your help freely, knowing that one day you will need help too. This created a bond of trust that allowed them to accomplish what seems impossible to us with our modern machinery and our relentless schedules. Now let us consider the silence of the quarry at night. After the sun has set and the workers have returned to their huts, the quarry rests. The stones cool. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. The stars come out, but they are different here. They are brighter, closer, more numerous. The Milky Way is a thick river of light, so brilliant that it casts faint shadows on the ground. And in that silence, you can almost hear the stones breathing. They expand slightly in the warmth of the day and contract in the cold of the night, just like the stonecutters themselves, whose chests rise and fall in the thin air as they sleep, dreaming of the next morning's work. It is a profound thing to think about, how these people spent their entire lives in this rhythm. They were born in the highlands, raised on quinoa and potatoes, taught to walk on steep paths without slipping. By the time they were teenagers, they could carry a load of stones on their backs, using a tumbline across their foreheads to distribute the weight. By the time they were adults, they had learned the secrets of the stone, the way it breaks along certain planes, the way it rings when struck. They knew which hammers to use for which stones, how to shape a corner piece, how to create a slight inward slope on a wall so that it would resist earthquakes. They passed this knowledge on to their children, who passed it on to theirs for countless generations. And then came the Spanish, with their iron tools and their horses and their guns. They saw the stone walls and marveled at them, but they did not understand them. They thought the Inca had secret techniques, perhaps a chemical that softened stone. They searched for the lost knowledge, tortured indigenous masons to reveal it, but there was no secret technique to reveal. There was only patience, time, and a deep spiritual connection to the material. The Spanish never learned that lesson. They built their own buildings on top of the Inca foundations, and those buildings have long since crumbled, earthquakes, or been replaced, while the Inca foundations remain solid and silent, holding up new walls that will also one day fall. There is a lesson there for us if we care to listen. Are always looking for shortcuts, for the faster way, the better tool. But the Inca remind us that the best tools are often the simplest: a stone hammer, a bronze chisel, and a willingness to spend as much time as is needed. They remind us that the most important thing is not the final product, but the process, the quality of attention you bring to each moment. And they remind us that you cannot rush the mountains. The mountains have been there for millions of years, and they will be there long after we are gone. They move at their own pace, grinding down slowly, lifting up slowly. The Inca learned to move with them, to become a part of their slow dance. So now, as you lie in your bed, in whatever room you are listening to this, think of the stonecutters of the Inca. They are not gone. Their spirit lives on in every stone wall that still stands, in every terrace that still grows corn, in every canal that still carries water from the melting glaciers. Their hands shaped the world, and that world still shapes us if we let it. And there is one more thing I want to share with you. High in the Andes, near the pass known as Punta de la Cordillera, there's a small outcropping of stone that looks almost unnatural. It is a single boulder about the size of a car that has been carved with a series of small niches and channels. It is not part of any building. It sits alone, exposed to the wind and the sun. The locals call it the Piedra del Silencio, the stone of silence. The story is that a group of stonecutters, on their way to a work site, stopped here to rest. One of them, an old master, sat down on this boulder and began to carve the niches, just for the pleasure of it. He did not need to, but he wanted to leave something beautiful in this lonely place. He worked for 3 days while the others waited. Then he stood up, and they continued their journey. The stone remains there, untouched by looters or archaeologists, a quiet testament to the love that the Inca had for their craft. And that is where I will leave you tonight, in the silence of the high Andes, with the wind whispering through the grass and the stars lighting the path. The stonecutters have gone home. Their hammers are still. The stones are waiting for tomorrow. And so are you, ready to dream of a world where patience is a virtue, where the slow rhythm of the hammer is a lullaby, and where every stone has a story to tell. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as solid and enduring as the walls of the Inca. But before you truly drift off, Let me share one more image from those high places. It is a picture of a single stone, not a great wall or a royal palace, but a simple block of granite that sits in a field near the village of Tambo. This stone is about the size of a bathtub, and it has a curious feature: a series of small holes drilled into its top, each about the width of a finger, arranged in a spiral pattern. No one knows exactly what it was used for. Some say it was a sundial of sorts, meant to track the movement of the sun across the seasons. Others say it was a ceremonial stone where offerings of coca leaves and chicha were placed to bless the harvest. But the local farmers will tell you, with a quiet smile, that it is simply a stone that was left unfinished, a project set aside when the Spanish arrived and never returned to. The spiral holes are the marks of the stonecutters' drill, a tool called a pichu, which was a hollow tube of copper or bronze, spun with a bow and fed with a slurry of sand and water. It was a slow process, drilling a hole. The bow would be pulled back and forth, while the drill spun and the sand ground away the rock. It might take an entire day to drill a hole a few inches deep. And here, on this stone, there are dozens of holes, each one a day of patient work. The spiral pattern suggests a deliberate design, perhaps a map of the stars or a sacred symbol. But the stonecutter who began this work never finished it. He or she left the spiral incomplete, as if interrupted mid-stroke. Think of that: a person sitting on a hillside, high in the Andes, with a thin little drill in their hands, the bow moving in a steady rhythm, the sun moving across the sky, the wind blowing, and the only sound the soft rasp of sand against stone. They worked for days, weeks maybe, creating this spiral. And then one day they stopped. They put down the drill, stood up, and never came back. Perhaps they heard the news of the Spanish arrival and fled. Perhaps they were conscripted into labor elsewhere. Or perhaps they simply died, their final duty to the spirits of the place complete. The stone remains, a reminder of a story that will never be fully told. I like to imagine that stonecutter was an old woman, because in Inca society, women were often the ones who prepared the ritual offerings and knew the sacred geometry. She might have been a priestess of Pachamama, the Earth Mother, and the spiral was a prayer carved into the rock. She would have come to this stone every day at dawn, when the light was soft and the air was still. She would have brought a small bundle of coca leaves, a handful of quinoa, and a tiny gourd of chicha. She would sit cross-legged on the ground, her back straight, her hands steady. She would begin to drill, slowly, methodically, each turn of the bow a word in a silent conversation with the mountain. The stone would sing a little, a high-pitched whine from the friction, and she would listen to that sound, adjusting her pressure, adding more sand when the drill slowed. The hours passed like clouds drifting across the valley. No one rushed her. No one told her to work faster. The mountain did not care about deadlines. The sun did not care about productivity. Only the stone mattered. And when she finally stopped, she left behind not just a spiral, but a piece of her own spirit. That is what the Inca believed, that every tool, Every building, every stone carried the energy of the person who worked on it. A wall built with anger would crack. A wall built with love would stand forever. And so the stonecutters and stonecarvers approached their work with a reverence that bordered on the religious. They would offer prayers and songs to the stone before they even touched it. They would burn offerings of llama fat and maize to ask permission. They would sometimes sleep next to the stone to get to know its dreams. And then, only then, would they begin to shape it. This might sound like a fanciful story, a bit of folklore that we tell ourselves to romanticize the past. But modern masons who work with traditional Inca techniques, the few who still practice the old ways, will tell you that they feel the same thing. They speak of a stone's character, the way it resists or yields, the way it holds moisture, the way it rings when struck. They say that a stone that has been mistreated will never fit well. It will always be slightly loose, slightly crooked, as if it is holding a grudge. And a stone that has been treated with respect will lock into place with a kind of sigh, a settling that feels almost alive. One mason I heard of, a man named Don Marcelo from the village of Chinchero, would sometimes sit with a stone for an hour before he even picked up his hammer. He would look at it from every angle, run his hands over its surface, close his eyes, and feel its temperature. And then he would know exactly where to strike. He never missed, he said, because the stone had told him where it wanted to break. Don Marcelo also said something else that stuck with me. He said that the thin mountain air was not a problem. It was a gift. The low oxygen made his mind sharper, clearer, less cluttered. The cold kept him alert. The wind kept him honest. He said that down in the lowlands, near the coast, people were always drowsy, always distracted. They had too much air, he said, and it made them lazy. Up in the highlands, every breath was a treasure. You learned to use it wisely. You learned to move slowly, to think before you acted, to conserve your energy for the moments that truly mattered. That is why the Inca built so well, he believed. Not because they were stronger, but because they were more present. There is a scientific basis for this, of course. At high altitudes, the body produces more red blood cells to carry oxygen. The heart beats a little faster. The lungs work a little harder. And the brain, starved of its usual supply, sometimes enters a state of mild euphoria, a heightened clarity. It is why so many highland peoples have traditions of deep meditation and visionary rituals. The thin air opens a door in the mind. The Inca stonecutters, working day after day in that environment, would have been in an almost altered state of consciousness, their perception sharpened, their focus intense. They would have seen the tiny imperfections in the stone, the subtle color changes, the veins of mica that could cause a crack. They would have felt the energy of the sun on the rock, the way it expands and contracts differently in morning light versus afternoon shadows. They knew these things not from textbooks, but from direct, embodied experience. Now I want you to imagine something else. Imagine a group of these stonecutters, perhaps a dozen or so, gathered around a massive block of andesite. The block has been dragged from the quarry, which might be miles away, using rollers of wood and a system of ropes made from cactus fibers. It has taken them weeks to get it here. The block weighs perhaps 20 or 30 tons. It sits on a bed of gravel, tilted at a slight angle. The master stonecutter walks around it, tapping it with a small hammer. He listens to the sound. He stops near one corner and taps again. He nods. He speaks a few words, and the others position themselves around the block. They have no heavy machinery, no cranes, no hydraulic jacks. They have bronze chisels, stone hammers, and lengths of rope. And they have time. The master takes a chisel and places it on a line he has drawn. He strikes it once, a single, sharp blow. A crack appears, running along the line. He strikes again, slightly to the left. The crack follows. He continues, each blow precise, each note in a musical phrase. The other workers watch in silence. They are not idle, they are learning. They are memorizing the pattern of strikes, the rhythm, the way the master's body moves. This is how knowledge is transmitted, not through written instructions, but through observation and imitation. After a while, the master steps back. He gestures to a younger man. The young man steps forward, takes the hammer, and attempts to replicate the blow. He misses slightly, and the crack veers off. The master does not scold him. He simply places his hand on the young man's shoulder, guides his arm, shows him the correct angle. The young man tries again. This time, the crack follows the intended line. A small smile passes between them. Then they continue working together, the master and the apprentice, their hammers rising and falling in a slow, steady dance. And all around them, the mountains stand silent. The wind carries the sound of their work across the valley, a distant tapping that echoes off the cliffs. To anyone listening from below, it might sound like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. And in a way, it was. The Inca believed that the mountains were alive, that they were apis, powerful spirits that watched over the land. Every blow of the hammer was a prayer to the Apu of that mountain. Every stone that was placed in a wall was an offering. The walls themselves were not just functional, they were sacred architecture, designed to channel the energy of the land. That is why they were built with such precision. It was not just about preventing earthquakes. It was about creating a harmony between the human-made and the natural, a union of stone and spirit. I read once in a book by a scholar named John Hislop that the Inca roads and buildings were designed to be walked slowly. The roads had frequent rest stops, called tambos, where travelers could rest, eat, and offer prayers. The stairways were shallow, meant to be climbed with a deliberate, unhurried step. The doorways were low, forcing you to bow as you entered. Every element was designed to slow you down, to bring you into the present moment. The Inca understood that speed is the enemy of awareness. When you rush, you miss the signs. When you hurry, you forget the spirits. The thin mountain air only reinforced this lesson. You could not rush. If you tried, you would faint. You would stumble. You would die. So you learned to move with the pace of the landscape, which has always been slow. Consider the glaciers that feed the streams that water the terraces. They move inches per year. Consider the mountains themselves, which rise millimeters per century. Consider the stars, which creep across the sky so slowly that our ancestors mapped them into constellations that seemed fixed. The Inca aligned their cities to these slow celestial movements, building temples that marked the solstice sunrise, the equinox sunset, the rising of the Pleiades. They lived in a world where time was measured not by the tick of a clock, but by the arc of the sun, the growth of a crop, the aging of a stone. And they were content with that. I think sometimes, when I lie in my own bed and listen to the hum of the refrigerator or the distant traffic, how different that world was. No engines, no screens, no advertisements. Just the sound of wind and water and the occasional bark of a llama. The nights were truly dark, the kind of dark you only experience in remote places, where the stars are so bright they seem almost close enough to touch. And in that darkness, the Inca stonecutters would have told stories. They would have gathered around a fire, chewing coca leaves to stay alert, and shared tales of the old ones, the ancestors who had built the first walls, the first terraces, the first canals. They would have sung songs, their voices rising and falling in the flickering firelight. And then they would have slept, wrapped in llama blankets, their dreams filled with stone and sky. There is a particular type of coca that was used by the Inca, called mamataki, which was believed to enhance endurance and reduce fatigue. The stonecutters would carry pouches of it, along with a small amount of lime or ash to activate the alkaloids. They would chew it slowly, letting the leaves release their energy bit by bit. It was not a stimulant like coffee, which jolts you awake. It was a gentle sustainer, a kind of steady fuel that kept you going hour after hour. Combined with the thin air, it created a state of calm alertness, a perfect balance for the patient labor of stoneworking. And so they worked day after day, year after year, generation after generation. They built Sacsayhuaman, the great fortress above Cusco, with its zigzag walls of massive stones that fit so tightly that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. They built Machu Picchu, perched on a ridge between two peaks, its terraces and temples aligned to the sun and the mountains. They built Ollantaytambo, with its terraced hillside and its unfinished temple, where stones as large as trucks lie scattered, as if abandoned mid-construction. They built a network of roads that stretched from Ecuador to Chile, with bridges woven from grass that swayed in the wind. And they did it all without metal tools that could cut hard stone, without wheeled vehicles, without written language. They did it with stone hammers and bronze chisels, and an unshakable conviction that the world was alive, and that every stone had a spirit. When the Spanish came, they tried to destroy this world. They smashed the idols, burned the sacred sites, and forced the people into labor and conversion. But they could not destroy the stones. Those stones remain in the walls of Cusco, in the terraces of the sacred valley, in the ruins of Machu Picchu. And the spirit of the stonecutters remains too, in the memory of the people. I met a woman once in a market in Pisac who sold small carvings of stone. She was elderly, with graying hair tied in 2 braids, and she had a little stall with tiny figurines of llamas, condors, and snakes. I asked her how she learned to carve. She said her grandfather had taught her, and his grandfather before him, and so on back to the time before the Spanish. She said the same thing I have heard so many times. The stone tells you what it wants to become. You just have to listen. I bought a tiny condor from her, no bigger than my thumb, carved from a dark green stone. I keep it on my desk. Sometimes, when I am writing late at night, I pick it up and hold it. It is cool and smooth, and I imagine the hands that shaped it, hands that have been shaping stone for 500 years. And I think about the thin mountain air, the silence of the quarry, the slow rhythm of the hammer. It is a humbling thing. We think we have conquered the world with our machines and our speed, but the stones remember a different way. And now, as you drift even closer to sleep, let me take you to one more place. It is a small canyon near the village of Chaquiquero, which means cradle of gold. It is a ruin that is even more remote than Machu Picchu, reachable only by a 2-day hike. There, on a steep slope, is a set of terraces that have been carved into the shape of a giant condor. The stones are arranged to form the wings, the head, the beak, all outlined in white granite against the dark earth. It is a geoglyph, a kind of earth art, but it is not just a drawing. It is a 3-dimensional construction with retaining walls and drainage channels. The Inca built it as an offering to the condor, the messenger of the heavens. For centuries, it was hidden by vegetation. It was only rediscovered in the 1990s. And when archaeologists cleared the brush, they found that the condor was still perfectly intact, its stones still fitted, its shape still recognizable. The condor had been waiting, silent and patient, for someone to notice it again. That is how the Inca built. They built for the long view. They built for a world that would outlast them. They built with the understanding that the mountains would endure, that the stars would continue their slow march, that the earth would hold their work in its embrace. And they built with love, a love that is still present in every stone, every carving, every terrace. You can feel it if you are quiet. You can feel it if you close your eyes and let the images drift. So rest now. Let the sound of these words be like a gentle river carrying you downstream. The stonecutters have finished their work for today. The hammers are put away. The chisels are laid on a bed of soft wool. The stones are settling into their places, growing cool in the night air. And somewhere, high in the Andes, a condor circles in the darkness, its wings cutting the thin air. It is silent. It is watching. It is a reminder that some things are eternal, and that the patient work of hands can join the eternal. Sleep well. The stones will be waiting tomorrow. They are always waiting. And yet, even as you drift into that deep and dreamy place, let me tell you one more thing about those stones. They were not just waiting, they were listening. The Inca believed that stone had ears. They believed that the mountains heard their prayers, that the rivers carried their words, that the earth itself was a great living being. When a stonecutter struck a block of granite, he was not just breaking rock. He was speaking to the mountain, asking it to yield a piece of itself, promising to treat it with respect. And the mountain, in its slow and ancient way, would answer. It would show him the hidden fractures, the natural grains, the places where the stone was weakest. A good stonecutter learned to read those signs the way a farmer reads the clouds, the way a shepherd reads the stars. There's a quarry high above the sacred valley called Rumicalca, which means stone storehouse. It is a place of great cliffs and deep crevices, where the Incas extracted the gray-white granite that built many of their finest structures. Even today, you can see the marks of their tools on the rock faces, shallow grooves, and circular depressions where they pounded and wedged. The blocks were not cut so much as liberated. The stonecutters would light fires against the rock face, then pour cold water to crack it along natural seams. They would drive wooden wedges into the cracks and soak them with water, letting the swelling wood split the stone. It was a slow process, requiring patience and an intimate knowledge of the rock's behavior. They could not afford to be careless. A single mistake could ruin a block that took days to shape. And there is a particular stone at Rumicalca that the local people still speak of. They call it the sleeping stone because it lies half detached from the cliff, as if it dozed off during the process. It is enormous, larger than any of the blocks used in the walls of Cusco. The story goes that a master stonecutter named Huaman, which means hawk, was working on this stone when he received word that his wife had given birth to a son. He was overjoyed, and he hurried down the mountain to see the child. But the stone, sensing his absence, grew sad. It did not want to be finished by another hand. It waited for Huaman to return, but he never did. He fell ill and died shortly after. And so the stone remains, leaning against the cliff, still waiting for its master to come back and complete the work. The local people say that if you press your ear to it on a quiet night, you can hear a faint humming, the sound of the stone dreaming of its final shape. This story may or may not be true, but it reflects something important about the Inca relationship with stone. They did not see it as inert or lifeless. They saw it as a relative, a part of the family of the earth. When they built a wall, they were not just stacking blocks. They were weaving a fabric, joining the mountain to the valley, the sky to the soil. Every stone had a place, and that place was determined by its character, its grain, its color, its history. The stonecutters would spend hours, sometimes days, studying a block before they even touched it with a tool. They would walk around it, run their hands over its surface, murmur to it. They were like sculptors who see the figure already hidden inside the marble, waiting to be set free. And this brings us to a curious fact about Inca stonework that often puzzles modern engineers. The stones in many walls are not just fitted together. They are joined in a way that is almost organic. The joints are not straight lines. They curve and taper, like the seams of a well-tailored coat. This is because the Incas did not cut the stones to a predetermined shape. They cut each stone to fit the unique shape of its neighbors. They built the wall as they went, one stone at a time, adjusting each new block to the contours of the ones already in place. It was a process of continuous adaptation, like a conversation between the builder and the wall. There were no blueprints, no plans drawn on paper. The plans were in the mind and in the hands, and they evolved as the work progressed. Think of how different this is from modern construction. We measure, we calculate, we design everything in advance. We order standardized blocks and pour standardized concrete. Everything is uniform, interchangeable. But the Inca wall is a record of decisions made in the moment. It has a kind of improvisational quality, like jazz. You can see the fingerprints of the individual stonecutters in the slight variations of angle and curve. Some stones have been carved with small nubs or protrusions, which may have been handles for moving them or just decorative flourishes. Some stones have been polished to a mirror shine, while others are left rough. It is as if the wall is a diary telling the story of its own creation. And then there is the question of how they moved these massive blocks. Some weigh more than 100 tons. The Spanish chroniclers recorded that the Incas used ramps of earth and logs, and that they would drag the stones with ropes made of llama hide or plant fibers. Thousands of men might be involved in moving a single block, pulling together in a rhythm that was set by chanters. They would sing songs of praise to the stone, asking it to move willingly. And when the block finally slid into place, they would celebrate with feasting and music. It was a communal effort, a festival of labor. But there's also evidence that they used a technique called the sloping ramp, where they would build a temporary earthen incline up the side of the wall, and then slide the stone up it on a bed of logs. At the top, they would lever it into position using wooden poles and bronze pry bars. It was dangerous work. A stone that slipped could crush a dozen men. But the Incas were careful. They had a deep respect for the power of the stone, and they took every precaution. They also had a spiritual protection. Before moving a major block, they would make an offering to the mountain, burning coca leaves and pouring chicha, a corn beer, onto the ground. They would ask the apis, the mountain spirits, for their blessing. And if the blessing was not given, they would wait. They would wait for a sign, a dream, a vision. They would not force the stone. All of this happened in the thin mountain air, where every breath was a conscious effort. The altitude saps your strength, dulls your thinking, makes you sleepy. And yet these men accomplished feats that still baffle us. How did they do it? Perhaps the answer is that they did not fight the altitude. They accepted it. They moved slowly, rested often, and worked in shifts. They chewed their coca leaves and drank their chicha. They told stories to keep their spirits up. They sang. They prayed. And they trusted that the work would be finished in its own time, which was the time of the earth, not the time of clocks. I am reminded of a conversation I had once with a stonemason in the town of San Sebastian, near Cusco. He was restoring an Inca wall that had been damaged by an earthquake. He showed me how he would select a stone from a pile of rubble, one that had fallen centuries ago, and then he would spend an entire day cutting it to fit a gap no wider than a finger. He used only hand tools, a hammer and a chisel, the same tools the Incas used. I asked him why he did not use electric saws or diamond blades. He laughed and said that would be disrespectful. The Inca way was slower, yes, but it was also more honest. The stone knew the difference, and when he placed that stone into the wall, and it fit perfectly, with no mortar, no gap, he felt a satisfaction that no machine could give. He said he could feel the spirits of the old stonecutters watching him, and he wanted them to be proud. That is the legacy of the Inca stonecutters. It is not just a legacy of physical structures, but of a way of being in the world. They taught us that you can do great things without great hurry. They taught us that attention is a form of love. They taught us that the earth is alive, and that our work should honor that life. And in a world that is always speeding up, always demanding more, always measuring time in fractions of seconds, their lesson is more valuable than ever. So, as you settle deeper into your pillow, let the image of those ancient stonecutters fill your mind. See them at dawn, climbing the steep trail to the quarry, their breath misting in the cold air. See them gather around a stone, running their hands over its surface, talking to it in low voices. See the first blow of the hammer, a single sharp crack that echoes across the valley. See the chips of stone fly, each one a small sacrifice. See the stone slowly take shape, becoming a block, a wedge, a curve. And then see the procession of men dragging it down the mountain, their ropes creaking, their voices chanting, their eyes fixed on the destination. They did not build for fame. They did not carve their names into the walls. They did not leave records of their individual achievements. They built for the community, for the gods, for the future. They built for you, for me, for all the generations that would come after. They built with the knowledge that the stone would outlast them, that the walls would stand for centuries, that the memory of their work would become a kind of prayer. And now, the night is growing deeper. The stars have shifted in their slow dance. The moon has risen over the mountains, casting silver light on the terraces and the walls. The stonecutters have gone to their homes, where their families are waiting. They will eat a simple meal of potatoes and quinoa, drink a cup of hot mate, and then lie down on their sleeping mats, their bodies tired but content. They will dream of the stone, the mountain, the condor. And somewhere, in a ruin that is still standing, a stone will shift ever so slightly, settling into the earth, whispering its ancient song. Let that song carry you. Let it be the last thing you hear before sleep claims you. You are safe. The stone is patient. The world is old and still turning. And tomorrow, when you wake, the mountains will be there, unchanged, reminding you that some things are eternal. But for now, rest. The thin air has become your blanket, the stars your lullaby. Sleep well. But perhaps you haven't yet heard the most curious detail of all, the one that makes the Inca stonecutters feel like figures from a myth rather than history. It is the way they understood the stone itself. They believed that every piece of rock had a spirit, a kind of personality. Some stones were shy and reluctant. Others were eager and cooperative. The stonemasons would spend days sitting with a block, studying its grain, its cracks, its hidden lines of weakness. They would learn its moods. They would even give it a name. This was not superstition in the way we might think of it today. It was a practical form of knowledge, a way of seeing the world as alive and responsive. When you treat the stone as a partner, not just a material, you handle it with a different touch. You listen for its answer. There is a story I heard from an elder in the village of Tambo, a place where the ruins still hum with ancient energy. He told me about a particular stone that had resisted every attempt to move it. For 3 days, the workers had tried to lever it onto a sledge, but it would not budge. The ropes snapped, the logs split, the men grew frustrated, and then the head mason did something strange. He sat down beside the stone, closed his eyes, and began to breathe slowly, deeply, matching his rhythm to the thin air. He stayed like that for an hour, motionless, while the others watched in silence. Finally, he opened his eyes and said, "The stone is waiting for its mother." He ordered the workers to bring a smaller stone from the same quarry, a piece that had originally lain beside the big one. They placed it close, and then, almost effortlessly, the large stone shifted, as if it had recognized its kin. They tied the ropes again, and this time it moved willingly. The elder smiled when he told me this. He said, "The Incas knew that everything is connected. A stone remembers where it came from. It wants to be with its family." Now, I do not know if that story is literally true. Perhaps it is a parable, a way of teaching respect for the material world. But it captures something essential about the Inca approach. They did not see the world as a collection of inert objects to be dominated. They saw it as a web of relationships, of obligations and affections. And the stonecutters' work was to honor those relationships. That is why they never forced a block into place. If the fit was not perfect, they would try a different stone, or they would adjust the adjacent stone, or they would wait. Patience was not just a virtue, it was a technique. Rushing would break the bond between the stone and the wall would be weaker for it. Think of the enormous quantities of stone they moved. At Sacsayhuaman, the fortress overlooking Cusco, some of the stones are over 20 feet tall and weigh more than 100 tons. They were carved and fitted with a precision that leaves modern engineers shaking their heads. The joints are so tight that you cannot slip a piece of paper between them. And yet the walls are not rigid. They have a slight give, like the skin of a living thing. During an earthquake, these walls can sway and settle, absorbing the shock without collapsing. They were designed to move, to breathe. The Incas knew that the earth itself was alive, and that a building must be alive too, must be flexible, must dance with the ground. I recall standing in front of the 12-angle stone in Cusco, a famous block in the wall of the Palace of the Roca. It is a dark, volcanic rock, polished to a velvet smoothness by centuries of rain and wind and the touch of human hands. The stone has 12 distinct faces, each one cut at a different angle, fitting perfectly into the neighboring blocks. It looks like a piece of a giant puzzle, but a puzzle where the pieces were carved one at a time, each one unique. I touched the surface, and it was cool and slightly damp. I could feel the slight irregularities, the tiny bumps and hollows left by the stonecutters' tools. It was like reading Braille, a language of texture. The local guides say that if you press your ear to the stone at night, you can hear a faint humming, the sound of the earth's energy flowing through it. I tried it once when the square was empty and the moon was high. I heard nothing but my own pulse, but that was enough. It felt like the stone was listening to me. The technique they used to achieve such perfect fits is still a matter of debate. Some archaeologists think they used a system of trial and error, lifting the stone into place, marking the points of contact, then lowering it again to chip away the high spots. Others believe they used a kind of plaster or clay to make an impression of the gap, then carved the stone to match that impression. But no one knows for sure. The Incas left no written records, no manuals, no drawings. Their knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship, through the hands and the eyes and the breath. It was a living knowledge, not a dead one. And it died with them, or mostly died. Some fragments survive in the work of the traditional stonemasons of the Andes, who still use the old ways, but the full secret is lost. Perhaps that is why the ruins feel so mysterious. They are not just buildings, they are the remnants of a way of thinking that is almost alien to us. We are so used to efficiency, to speed, to the logic of machines. The Incas were not. They had their own logic, a logic of the mountain, of the river, of the wind. They built not to dominate nature, but to participate in it. Their walls follow the contours of the land, not the other way around. Their terraces are aligned with the movements of the sun and the moon. Their roads are a web of connections, like the veins of a leaf. Everything is part of a larger pattern, a pattern that cannot be seen from a single point, only felt. And so, as you lie there, half asleep, perhaps you can feel that pattern too. The Incas believed that the world was made of three realms: the Pacha, the world above, where the gods and the stars dwell, the Pacha, the world here, where humans live, and the Pacha, the world below, where the ancestors and the dead reside. These realms were not separate. They were stacked on top of each other, like layers of a cake, and they communicated through a central axis, the axis mundi, which they called the Waka. The mountains were Wakas. The stones were Wakas. Even certain trees and springs were Wakas. They were places where the realms touched, where you could reach through and speak to the spirits. The stonecutters were workers of the Pacha. They brought the stone from the depths of the earth, from the womb of the mountain, and they shaped it into forms that could hold the energy of the Pacha. They were bridging the worlds. Every wall they built was a threshold, a doorway between the everyday and the sacred. That is why the Spanish, when they conquered the Inca Empire, were so eager to dismantle the walls and build their own churches on top of them. They wanted to break the connection, to replace the old gods with the new. But they could not. The stones were too heavy, too stubborn. They remain, embedded in the foundations of Cusco, silent witnesses to a civilization that refused to be forgotten. I think of the workers who dragged those stones. They were not slaves, not in the way we understand slavery. They were part of a system of reciprocal labor called the mita, where each community contributed workers for public projects. They were fed, housed, and celebrated. They brought their families, their music, their coca. It was a festival of shared effort, a way of binding the community together. The work was hard, but it was also joyful. There is a Quechua word, aini, which means reciprocal exchange, the idea that you give without expecting immediate return, knowing that the universe will balance itself. Every stone placed in the wall was an act of aini, a gift to the future. And you, in this quiet moment, are a recipient of that gift. The walls that still stand, the terraces that still hold the soil, the roads that still lead to the mountains, they are the inheritance of a people who understood that true strength comes from cooperation, not from force. They built with love, and love is the only thing that does not crumble. The night is deep now. The air has grown colder. Outside, the constellations of the southern sky wheel slowly overhead. There is the Southern Cross, tilted and bright. There is the dark cloud of the Llama, the shadow of the Milky Way. The Incas saw shapes in these stars, stories of animals and heroes, of rivers and journeys. They saw the sky as a reflection of the earth, a map of their own lives. The stonecutters would have looked up at the stars as they worked, measuring time by their rise and fall. They knew that the universe is a cycle, and that our small labors are part of that cycle. And so, let us return to the stone. Imagine it one last time, a single block of black andesite lying on a wooden sledge. Around it, a crowd of men and women, their faces lit by torches. They are singing, a low, steady chant that sounds like the wind. They pull on the ropes, and the stone begins to move inch by inch up the earthen ramp. The chant grows louder, then softer, then louder again. The stone reaches the top. They lever it into place. It fits. There is a cheer, a burst of laughter, a splash of chicha poured on the ground. And then they begin the work of the next stone, and the next, tomorrow and the day after, until the wall is finished and the city is whole. You can still visit that city. You can walk its streets and touch its walls. You can stand in the plaza and feel the weight of history on your shoulders, but it is a light weight, like a blanket. The Incas built for eternity, but eternity is not a destination. It is a quality of attention. If you give your full attention to something, even for a moment, it becomes eternal. The stone you touched today was touched by hands that existed 400 years ago. Time collapses. You are there, and they are here. Now, the story is almost done. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers. The last light is fading. Your breathing has slowed. The thin air has become a comfort, not a struggle. It carries the scent of dry earth and pine. Somewhere a dog barks once, then falls silent. The world is at rest. The stonecutters are at rest. And you too are ready to let go. Close your eyes. See the stone one more time, but now it is not a block. It is a wall, a city, a mountain. It is the entire empire, built stone by stone, breath by breath. And you are part of it. You have always been part of it. The stonecutter inside you, the one who shapes your dreams, is still working patiently, lovingly, in the quiet of the night. Good night. Sleep deep. The stones will hold. Good night. Sleep deep. The stones will hold. But do not close your eyes just yet. for there is one more story to tell, one more stone to turn over in your mind like a smooth pebble from the river. It is a story about the air itself, the very thing you have been breathing, thin and cool as you lie here. The Incas understood air in a way we have forgotten. They knew that air was not empty. It was alive. It carried the voices of the ancestors, the scent of the mountain flowers, the sound of the distant glacier. And it was a force they had to work with, not against, when they shaped their stones. Think of a stonecutter named Whammon, if you will. He lived in the 15th century, in a village high in the Urubamba Valley. He was not a famous man. His name does not appear in any record, but his hands have left their mark on the walls of Ollantaytambo, a fortress town that seems to grow out of the cliffside. Whammon was a Chunka Kamyuk, a master of the stone, and he had trained since childhood. His father had taught him how to read the grain of the rock, how to tap it with a hammerstone and hear the hidden fractures, how to wait for the right moment to split it with a wedge of deer antler. It was a patient art, a meditation in motion. The thin air was his companion. At 13,000 feet, every breath is a conversation. The lungs learn to sip, not to gulp. The blood thickens, the heart beats a little faster, and the mind grows clear. Whammon would begin his work before dawn, when the cold was sharp and the stars still faint. He would chew a handful of coca leaves, a wad of lime, and let the mild stimulant wake his body without rushing it. The coca was a gift from the earth, a way to greet the day. He would offer a pinch of the leaves to the stone too, a small act of Aini, before he lifted his tool. His tool was simple, a rounded stone about the size of a fist, made of a harder rock called diorite. It fit perfectly in his palm, worn smooth by generations of use. He would strike the block of andesite with a gentle, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Not hard. Hard would shatter. He was coaxing the stone, not attacking it. The rhythm was like a heartbeat, steady and slow. The sound carried across the valley, a soft echo that blended with the calls of the birds and the rustle of the wind in the grass. The block he worked on that day was enormous, maybe 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, weighing many tons. It had been quarried from a ridge half a mile away, then dragged down a slope, across a stream, and up an earthen ramp that took a month to build. The ramp was a living thing, made of packed soil and stones, reinforced with logs. It rose at a gentle angle so that the workers could walk beside the sledge, not pull it uphill. They used ropes of maguey fiber, braided thick and strong, and they pulled together in a rhythm that matched the chant. The chant said, in Quechua, something like, "Pull for the sun, pull for the earth, pull for the children yet to come." When the block reached the top of the wall, it had to be lifted into place. This was the most delicate part. The workers would insert wooden levers under the stone and pry it upward inch by inch, while others slid thin slabs of stone underneath to keep it raised. Then they would tilt it, using a system of ropes and counterweights, until it leaned against the wall. Then they would lower it slowly, slowly, until it settled into the bed of clay that had been prepared. clay was a cushion, a soft landing, and it allowed for final adjustments. Whammon would then climb onto the block, lying flat on his belly, and reach down with a small chisel to scrape away a hair's width of stone from the concave face of the block above. He worked by feel, by sound, by instinct. The gap had to be perfect, so tight that the clay would be squeezed out and the stones would lock together, not with mortar, but with friction and gravity alone. I once tried to imagine the concentration required. You are lying on a cold stone at an altitude where every breath is a reminder of your mortality. Your fingers are numb. Your ears are filled with the sound of your own heartbeat, and you are carving a line that will be invisible to anyone who looks at the finished wall. But that line is the difference between a wall that stands for 500 years and a wall that crumbles in the first earthquake. The stone is not forgiving. It demands humility. And yet, the Incas did this again and again for decades across an entire empire. They built roads that crossed the Andes, hundreds of miles of stone pavement, with drainage canals and rest houses every few miles. They built suspension bridges woven from grass, strong enough to carry llamas. They built storehouses that were perfectly ventilated so that grain could last for years. They built sacrificial platforms where the sun would strike exactly at the solstice. Every structure was a response to the landscape, to the thin air, to the sun and the moon and the stars. I think of Whammon. On the evening of the day he fitted that great stone. The sun would have set behind the mountains, casting long purple shadows. The workers would have gathered in the plaza, sharing a meal of boiled potatoes and dried llama meat, seasoned with aji peppers. They would have drunk chicha, a maize beer, from a large ceramic vessel, passing it around until everyone had a sip. And then, as the stars came out, they would have told stories. Stories about the origin of the stones, about the great flood, about the hero who taught the people how to shape rocks. The stories were not just entertainment. They were instruction. They encoded knowledge about the behavior of stone, about the importance of patience, about the relationship between the worker and the material. In one story, the stones themselves were once people, turned to rock by the sun because they refused to work. That is why, when you tap a stone, it sometimes shudders, as if it remembers being alive. The story teaches respect. Do not strike the stone in anger. Ask it to yield. Listen to its answer. That is the secret of the perfect fit. I remember a stonemason I once met in the highlands, an old man named Jacinto. He was not Inca. His ancestors had come from Spain, but he had learned the old ways from his father, who had learned from his father, and so on back into the mist. He showed me how to choose a hammerstone by weight and balance. He told me to close my eyes and run my fingers over the face of a block. He could sense the internal structure, he said. He could feel where the stone was strong and where it was weak. He called it the stone's breath. I tried, but I could feel nothing. He laughed and said, "It takes time. The stone does not trust you yet." Jacinto died a few years ago in his sleep. I like to think that he is now in the Akupacha, working on a wall that will hold up the earth itself. That is the Andean view of death. You continue your work in a different realm, but your hands never stop. The stone is eternal, and so is the labor of love. Here, in the quiet of the night, the thought is comforting. The stones are not dead. They are dreaming. They hold the memory of the hands that touched them, the songs that echoed around them, the breath of the workers who struggled and celebrated and grew old beside them. When you press your ear to the stone, as I did in the plaza, you are not hearing a hum. You are hearing the accumulated silence of centuries. It is a sound so low that it is almost not there. But it is there. It is the sound of the world holding its breath. The thin air was a teacher for the Incas. It taught them to be slow, to be deliberate, to conserve energy and focus it on what mattered. It taught them that the body is not a machine, but a vessel for the spirit. Every movement they made was a prayer, an offering to the mountain. And the mountain accepted their offering and gave them stone in return. So let that thought accompany you as you drift. You are lying at an altitude where the stars seem closer, where the silence is deeper, where the stone walls outside your window are keeping watch. They do not need you to do anything. They just need you to be present. And you are. The fire has gone out. The last ember glows orange, then fades to gray. The room is dark, but the darkness is friendly, like the inside of a mountain. You do not need light. You have the memory of stone, the feel of it under your fingers, the echo of the chant in your ears. You are safe. You are part of the pattern. And now, truly, let your eyes close. Let your thoughts become like the loose stones on a slope, slowly settling, finding their place. Let your breathing become the rhythm of the ancient workers. Tap, tap, tap. There is no rush. There is only the stone and the air and the night. Good night again. Sleep deep. The stones will hold, as they always have, as they always will.